Sativa has this kind of stimulant-like effect and tends to be more of a head high, if you will. Indica tends to be more full-bodied and lead to more indica-couch, as I referred to it before, pun intended, deep relaxation, reduced insomnia, etc. Now, within each of those, sativa and indica, you have type 1, type 2, and type 3, and that has everything to do with how much THC, which is the dominant psychoactive compound, versus CBD, which has other effects mainly on the body, but not so much on the brain and modes of thinking and mood, etc. How much THC versus CBD is present. And again, type 1 is THC dominant, type 2 kind of equal ratios, if you will, of THC and CBD, and type 3 tend to be high CBD. Okay, so already we've got some categorization here that hopefully isn't overwhelming to you, but this turns out to be extremely important if you want to understand how cannabis works and predict the effects of cannabis. I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens, now called AG1, is a vitamin mineral probiotic drink that covers all of your foundational nutritional needs. I've been taking Athletic Greens since 2012, so I'm delighted that they're sponsoring the podcast. The reason I started taking Athletic Greens and the reason I still take Athletic Greens once or usually twice a day is that it gets me the probiotics that I need for gut health. Our gut is very important. It's populated by gut microbiota that communicate with the brain, the immune system, and basically all the biological systems of our body to strongly impact our immediate and long-term health. And those probiotics in Athletic Greens are optimal and vital for microbiotic health. In addition, Athletic Greens contains a number of adaptogens, vitamins, and minerals that make sure that all of my foundational nutritional needs are met, and it tastes great. If you'd like to try Athletic Greens, you can go to athleticgreens.com/Huberman, and they'll give you 5 free travel packs that make it really easy to mix up Athletic Greens while you're on the road, in the car, on the plane, etc. And they'll give you a year's supply of vitamin D3K2. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Huberman to get the 5 free travel packs and the year's supply of vitamin D3K2. Okay, so somewhat surprisingly, we're going to set aside cannabis. We're going to take what we know about sativa, indica, type 1, type 2, type 3, CBD, etc. We're just going to set that aside for a moment. Why would we do that? Well, we have to ask ourselves, why would any of these plants, why would any of these compounds, THC, CBD, sativa, indica, etc., why would any of that have any effect on us at all? And this discussion that we're about to have very much resembles the discussion that we had on a previous episode about nicotine. Because as many of you know, nicotine is a commonly used substance. In fact, if we were to look at the 3 most commonly used drugs, alcohol will be at the top of the list. Many billions of people regularly use alcohol or occasionally use alcohol. Many billions of people also use nicotine. It's the second most consumed drug. So more than 1 billion and probably closer to 2 billion people consume nicotine. And then the third most consumed drug is cannabis in one form or another. And many of you are probably shouting, what about caffeine? What about caffeine? Well, in the context of drugs, and in particular addictive drugs, caffeine doesn't quite rise to the list. But if we were to look at caffeine and included in that list, caffeine would be above all of those. Okay, but the most commonly used drugs are alcohol. Second after that is nicotine, and then cannabis. Nicotine, as some of you may know if you listened to the episode on nicotine, but even if you didn't, nicotine comes from the tobacco plant, and there are a few other plants that include nicotine, and typically it's brought into the brain and body by smoking tobacco, dipping tobacco, snuffing tobacco, or vaping nicotine. Nicotine exists in the outside world in these plants, the tobacco plants, but the reason it has an effect on the body is that there are so-called nicotinic receptors in the body. Now, those nicotinic receptors were named after nicotine, the compound, but they existed in the brain and body not because of the existence of a tobacco plant, but because there are other chemicals in the body that naturally occur, namely acetylcholine, that bind the nicotine receptor. Those chemicals, such as acetylcholine, that bind the nicotinic receptor in your brain and body, create an enhanced sense of focus, et cetera, et cetera. But nicotine from tobacco binds that same receptor, but with much greater affinity, and therefore also creates a state of focus, but a much greater one than we can achieve without nicotine. Okay, so you can see the nicotine episode if you want to learn more about that. In a very similar way, all of our brains and bodies, from the time that we are conceived, believe it or not, very shortly after conception, if we want to be accurate, very early conception, when you were in the womb, And still now, if you're listening to this, you have what are called cannabinoid receptors because you also have endogenous cannabinoids. What do we mean by that? You have receptors which are like little parking spots that are present on cells in your brain and body. And what we call a ligand, which is basically just a chemical that's released, parks in that receptor and causes a number of different biological effects. Cannabis contains compounds that also bind to those receptors. But here I want to make a really clear distinction. We have what are called endogenous ligands. Those just mean chemicals from within us that we make naturally. Even if we never go near the cannabis plant or any other source of cannabis, we have chemicals that are created in us that park in those receptors and cause biological effects on mood, on perception, on the immune system, on hunger, etc. Again, without ever going anywhere near cannabis. We have these endogenous cannabinoids. So endogenous cannabinoids are floating around in us, or I should say they are released in us in particular ways, bind to these receptors and cause changes in mood, appetite, etc. They have many different effects on the brain and body. We will talk about those. But just like with nicotine, there are substances in the outside world. In this case, cannabis contains these substances, so things like THC and like CBD, that when ingested by smoking or vaping or by ingesting edibles, also will park in those same receptors, the cannabinoid receptors, and lead to biological effects. Now, it's a little bit misleading because we call them cannabinoid receptors as if they were there to bind cannabis, or just like we call the nicotine receptors nicotinic receptors, it makes it seem as if they were there in order to bind nicotine from tobacco. But that's not the way our brains and bodies evolved. Our brains and bodies evolved for these receptors to make use of chemicals that exist within us called, again, endogenous chemicals. And those endogenous chemicals lead to certain effects, as I mentioned before. The key thing here, if you haven't understood anything I've said up until now, please understand this. The key thing is that THC and CBD and the other components of cannabis bind to those receptors, those endogenous cannabinoid receptors, the ones that we naturally make, with much greater affinity and exert a vastly greater potency and effect on mood and perception, etc., than do our endogenous cannabinoids. Another analogy that one could take in order to understand this would be hormones like testosterone and estrogen. Many people, I would say all people, make testosterone and estrogen to varying degrees. It's going to depend on whether or not you're male, female, your age, whether or not you've gone through puberty, et cetera, et cetera. But let's just take testosterone, for example. There's testosterone circulating in your body. That's true if you're male or female. And there are receptors called androgen receptors. We could even call them testosterone receptors. And the testosterone binds to those receptors and has effects on cells. It causes hair growth, changes the voice. It can affect libido. It affects all sorts of things in the brain and body, depending on which organ and tissue you're talking about. But of course, there are people that take synthetic testosterone or derivatives of testosterone. And some of those derivatives, for instance, in the bodybuilding community and the sports community, they will take things like Dianabol. These are modified versions of testosterone that can bind to the testosterone receptor with much greater affinity, or I should say the androgen receptor with much greater affinity, and have supraphysiological effects that would essentially never be seen from testosterone that was endogenously released within the body. We could say the same thing for estrogen. There are estrogen receptors, they bind estrogen, okay? But if someone were to take synthetic estrogen or to ingest a plant compound that contains various estrogenic compounds, and those plants certainly exist out there, they can have supraphysiological effects on those receptors. Why am I telling you this? Well, many people believe that because cannabis, marijuana, is a plant, and plants grow out of the ground, and they're naturally occurring, and because we have receptors in our body that are there without the need to engineer them from some external source, right? They're in our genome, it programmed for it, and we're born with these things, and we keep these things our entire life. Many people mistakenly think, these plant compounds are safer for us or better for us or are somehow appropriate for us to ingest. But that's simply not true. And here I'm not saying that cannabis is always a bad idea for people. There are certain populations and certain people for which it can be relatively safe recreationally. That's the truth. And there are other populations for which it can be downright dangerous recreationally or medicinally. And of course, there are medicinal purposes that are being explored, and we'll talk more about that. But this is vital to understand, because I think that when we hear, oh, it's from a plant, it's natural, and then you also have a receptor for these endogenous cannabinoid receptors, and therefore the marriage of those two, right? The coming together of the chemical THC or CBD or both with these receptors is somehow supposed to happen, as if this was a purpose of having these receptors. But it's simply not the case. In the same way that the nicotinic receptors are not there because nicotine is good for us. They're there because there are compounds that exist within us that are good to bind to those receptors from time to time. Now, here's the key thing about, I guess today I'm saying there are a lot of key things, but here's another key thing about understanding cannabis and the way that it works, which is that THC and CBD, when they're brought into the brain and body by smoking or, edible, et cetera, they bind to those receptors, those endogenous cannabinoid receptors, and they tap into the same systems that your endogenous cannabinoids would tap into, the ones that affect mood and energy and creativity and relaxation, et cetera. But they do so with thousand-fold greater potency. And as a consequence of that, your endogenous cannabinoids are outcompeted. They really get no opportunity to interact with those receptors. And understanding that can lead to a very clear understanding of why, for instance, when people use cannabis to relieve anxiety, or they use cannabis to enter a certain brain state for creativity or to enter sleep, why a dependence on cannabis starts to emerge. Because if they don't ingest cannabis, and again, ingest could mean smoke to bring THC in or CBD in, or ingest orally or even transdermal or tincture or one of the other varieties, if they don't do that, then what happens is not only are the receptors not stimulated to the same degree or with the same potency that they normally are, but the endogenous cannabinoids can no longer have their effect. So people experience heightened levels of anxiety, disrupted mood, disrupted brain state, and so on. Now, again, I want to be very clear that I'm not trying to paint a picture of cannabis as all bad or even partially bad. What I want to do today is give you as much information I can as to how cannabis works, how its different component parts work, how the different types of cannabis work, and point to some of the valid medicinal uses and some of the recreational uses, and then lay out the landscape for you as to who is really most at risk in terms of psychoactive components, immune components, and so on and so forth, so that you can make the most informed choice for you. I am not here to tell you what to do or what not to do. As I like to say, do as you wish, right? I mean, don't do as you wish if it harms other people or yourself, but do as you wish, but know what you're doing. So that's really my goal here. So as we begin to dive further into the biology, I think you'll start to get a clearer picture of why cannabis is so effective in some contexts, but also why it can create such massive suffering in other contexts because of the way that it outcompetes your own natural endogenous cannabinoid systems. So let's talk about those endogenous cannabinoid systems, what they are and how they work, because that will give us a lens into what the higher potency, sort of maximum impact of the various cannabis plant varieties and strains and THC and CBD and so forth, how and why those work. So what are the endogenous cannabinoids? These chemical substances that everybody makes.